Hello, today I'm going to be talking about Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas. This book was originally published in 2020. So, firstly, let's delve into the plot and pacing of the story. The plot centers around Yadriel, who is a young, gay, trans man growing up in a traditional Latinx Bruhix community. So, amidst recovering from the recent death of his mother, who acted as Yadriel's main support system, he's working to feel accepted by his family and his community. He's working to understand his new Brujo abilities and uncover a mystery involving a young spirit. I thought the pacing of the story was really great. It reads super quickly, super easily. It's really enjoyable and consistent throughout. I didn't feel like there were any lags in this story, and it's exciting pretty much from the first chapter. So the two main characters I'm going to focus on for this review are Yadriel and Julian. Yadriel is a young Brujo, and one of the really interesting elements of the story is Yadriel trying to discover not only his trans identity, but his identity as a Brujo. In the Bruhix community that he's involved in, the men and women have very different responsibilities, abilities, and kind of roles within the community as itself. This community is super tight-knit. It's all Yadriel has ever known. His father is the leader of the community. There's a lot of complexity there, which is really interesting to see. So kind of on the opposite end, we have Julian. Julian is a young spirit. He is super confident in himself. He knows exactly who he is. He's super bright and bubbly, but his family dynamic is really complicated and even strained. Essentially, he's an orphan being raised by his older brother. He and his brother have a really interesting relationship. You kind of learn more about his brother and that relationship as the story continues. And whenever a sibling has to step into the role of a parent, there's always going to be some complexity there. So delving into some of the aspects of the story that I really loved, the relationships in the story as a whole are really complex. I think specifically for Julian, all of his relationships are really complicated, and I really loved learning more about him as the story continues. The relationships in this story are all really complex. The relationships that Julian has with his friends, with his brother, with school, and kind of anything involving his life is super fun and fascinating. Yadriel's family relationships are all really great and well done, as well as his relationship with his best friend, who's his cousin as well. The story is really successful in its portrayal of self-love, and I feel like that's something that the author was definitely trying to convey through the story, and I think they did a really great job. Again, Julian is someone that loves himself. He knows himself. Even though he doesn't always like everything about him, he still kind of accepts it wholeheartedly, that this is a part of who he is, and this is just kind of how he lives and how he survives every day. Whereas Yadriel, it's like a much slower process. He's struggling with these kind of multiple identities that he's trying to figure out: his Brujo identity, his trans identity, his gay identity. And the intersectionality of all of that and the complexity of all of those identities kind of forming on top of each other while being an adolescent as a whole. It's like, oh man, that's so many different identities and so much complexity that's going on. I'm sure his mind is like a minefield, and he's just going through stuff all the time. But by the end of the story and through his relationship with Julian, he kind of learns more about like how to be confident in who he is and how to love himself, and knowing that sometimes that's enough. There's a really beautiful line in the story where Yadriel is talking about how he really wants acceptance from his family for being a Brujo. And Julian's like, well, is it for being a Brujo or is it for being a boy? Is this actually about your Brujo identity? Is this about your trans identity? And Julian says it in a way that's really beautiful, because it kind of shows like, you're saying that it's about one thing, but I think really it's about this other thing, and all of your identities are combined. And so the other really big point that's addressed in the story is the ideas of life, death, the afterlife, and grieving over death itself. Because the Bruhix community is so intertwined in this story with the idea of spirits and death, it's something that Yadriel is super familiar with. And to him, the idea of death isn't really permanent, because anyone he's ever known and loved, he always is able to see through the Day of the Dead, through the spirits still with them in the settlement that they live in. So he discovers early on that Julian, who's someone he knows from his school, but they don't really know each other because he isn't in the Bruhix community, when he dies, his spirit won't be able to come back. So as Yadriel and Julian start to develop a friendship, which develops even deeper into a kind of love, there's this idea of loss that is really permanent, that Yadriel has never really experienced before, because anyone, his mother, his grandparents, they're gone, but he can still see them. He can still talk to them. He can still touch them and tell them about his life, and they can reply and know what he's saying. Whereas Julian, who's someone he really cares about, maybe the first person he's really cared about in this kind of romantic way is someone that he may lose forever if his spirit is cut from the place that it's tethered to the earth. So the last really great point that I want to talk about is definitely a spoiler, but I want to talk about it because I felt like it was super important and super well done in the story. So at the end of the story, there's a villain unmasked for Julian's death, and Yadriel is involved in the climax of the story. There's a confrontation, and the villain ends up dying. The part about this that I thought was so well done was that even though Yadriel knew that this person had done really bad things and had hurt people he really cared about, he still felt a sense of guilt about it, and he still was like really struggling with the finality and the kind of brutality of it, and in a lot of ways kind of blamed himself. Like, did I kill this person? Did I do this bad thing? Am I bad for doing this? Throughout that whole kind of last part of the story, his whole family is so supportive and understands that Yadriel didn't do anything wrong, and that the person wasn't a bad person either, but a series of circumstances had made life difficult for that person, and they were suffering because of it, and they changed because of it, but that it wasn't their fault. I loved the idea that there wasn't blame, and that you can still grieve even if someone is bad, even if someone's a villain, even if someone has hurt you or tries to kill you or whatever else, you can still grieve for that person. And I thought that was really kind of unique. I haven't seen that a lot in stories, and I thought it was really interesting. It was really well done. Now to address some of the points which I didn't like as much in the story. So on a personal note, I'm kind of conflicted on a point, because Yadriel is a little bit thirsty for his family's acceptance and his community's embrace of him. And while I totally understand this and his reasons for this, and even why it's important and kind of helps in his beautiful character arc at the end of the story, it was also slightly detracting. Like, I kind of just wanted him to be a total badass and like do his own thing and just embrace himself from the very beginning. And it kind of took me out of like absolutely loving him as a character from the beginning to end, just because of that point. But again, I understand why the author chose to kind of make it more of a gradual journey, and it makes sense, and I still love the end of the journey. It's just like I wish he had been that way from the beginning of the novel. So my second gripe is that I felt like the story was pretty predictable, especially like the main meat of the story. Outside of the relationship of Yadriel and Julian, the trio of characters, Yadriel, Julian, and his cousin, are trying to uncover the mystery and the plot of the murders that have been happening. And unfortunately, the culprit is pretty obvious, and I felt like that whole kind of point of the story was pretty obvious, which was unfortunate because it was like a super cool idea and I really, really liked it. But I think it was just kind of foreshadowed one too many times. I think if it had been foreshadowed one time less, it would have been like perfect. But it was just one time too many. And I remember being like halfway through the book and I was like, this is exactly what's going on. This is who did it. This is what's happening. And it kind of took me out of it and made me want to stop reading just for a second because I was like, oh man, like I already know what's going to happen. I'm like 99% sure this is what's going to happen. Do I want to keep reading? But I did because I liked the characters, I liked the relationship, and I still wanted to kind of know, like, am I right for sure? So my overall thoughts, I actually really, really enjoyed the story. I loved learning more about the Bruhix community, even if in a fictional context. I thought the relationships were really beautiful. I thought the themes and lessons in the story were really beautiful. And the ultimate messages of love and acceptance were super well done and well received, in my opinion. I would actually love a sequel to this book too. I feel like it was really beautifully wrapped up, and I don't know if the author plans to continue the story, but I really liked the characters and I really liked the community. I thought it was all super cool, super interesting, and like pretty great world building. I'd love for there to be a sequel to this and kind of see like what happens next. Well, those are my thoughts after reading Cemetery Boy. If anyone else has read this, let me know your thoughts. Did you agree with some of the points I made? Did you completely disagree and have different opinions? Is this a book that you've thought about reading or you're thinking about reading after watching this review? Let me know. I'd love to know your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I hope everyone enjoyed this video.